In 2003, inside a boardroom in Billund, Denmark, executives at the world's most beloved toy company were staring at a number that felt impossible. The company was losing nearly $1 million every single day. Lego, the brand whose name literally meant play well, the maker of interlocking plastic bricks found in more homes than almost any toy on Earth, was hemorrhaging cash so fast that its own bankers were quietly preparing for the possibility of bankruptcy. Debt had ballooned past $800 million. Warehouses were stacked with unsold inventory nobody wanted. A company that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and 70 years of relentless competition was now weeks away from collapsing, not because of some external disaster, but because of the very people who ran it. The man who would eventually save it hadn't even wanted the job. He was 35 years old, had never run a toy company, and inherited a business so close to ruin that his own consultants told him liquidation might be the only responsible option. Lego had tried to save itself by abandoning the very thing that made it famous: the humble brick, chasing theme parks, video games, clothing lines, and licensing deals that diluted the brand into something almost unrecognizable. The company that once represented the purest form of creative play had nearly destroyed itself by trying to be everything except what it actually was. This is the story of how a small Danish carpentry workshop, born from the ashes of one man's failed furniture business, grew into the most powerful toy company on the planet, and how it nearly vanished entirely, undone not by a rival, not by a recession, but by its own reckless ambition to become something it was never meant to be. Ole Kirk Christiansen was born in 1891 in the small Danish farming village of Filskov, the youngest of 10 children in a poor rural family. There was no money for schooling beyond the basics, and Christiansen was apprenticed to a local carpenter at the age of 14, learning to shape wood by hand in workshops heated by little more than sawdust stoves. He spent his 20s working as a journeyman carpenter, traveling from town to town in the Danish countryside, building barns, furniture, and household goods for farmers who could rarely pay in anything more than food or shelter. By 1916, at 25 years old, he had saved enough to purchase a small carpentry and woodworking shop in the town of Billund, a modest settlement so small it barely appeared on regional maps, surrounded by nothing but farmland and forest. The timing could not have been worse. Denmark, though neutral during the First World War, suffered from the economic disruption rippling across Europe, and raw materials for carpentry became difficult and expensive to obtain. Christensen's business survived on thin margins, building coffins, furniture, and stepladders for a rural population with little disposable income. He married, started a family, and rebuilt after a workshop fire in 1924 destroyed nearly everything he owned. An early lesson in the fragility of everything he had built, one he would be forced to relearn many times over the following decades. The 1930s brought a catastrophe far larger than any single fire. The Great Depression crushed the Danish economy alongside the rest of the industrialized world, and demand for carpentry work collapsed entirely. Farmers stopped commissioning furniture. Construction projects halted. By 1932, Christensen's workshop was in such severe financial distress that he was forced to lay off most of his employees, keeping only his sons and a handful of loyal workers who agreed to continue for reduced wages, sometimes paid in food rather than cash. He was over 40 years old, deeply in debt, and watching a business he had spent 16 years building disintegrate beneath him. It was in this moment of near total failure that Christensen made a decision his neighbors considered close to reckless. He began making wooden toys, miniature trucks, pull-along ducks, yo-yos, and simple building blocks, carved and assembled from the scrap wood left over from furniture orders that were no longer coming in. It was not a calculated business strategy so much as an act of desperation, a way to keep his workshop's remaining lumber from going to waste and to generate any income at all during a period when full-size furniture simply wasn't selling. Toys, unlike furniture, were cheap enough that even cash-strapped Danish families might occasionally afford one, especially as gifts for children. In 1934, Christensen held an internal competition among his employees to choose a name for the toy-making side of the business, offering a bottle of homemade wine as the prize. He submitted his own entry, a combination of the Danish words leg god, meaning play well. The name Lego won. He would only later discover, with some satisfaction, that the word also meant I put together or I assemble in Latin, a coincidence that seemed, in hindsight, almost too perfect for a company that would eventually become famous for interlocking bricks. The wooden toy business grew slowly through the mid-1930s, but disaster struck again in 1942 when a fire, the second in Christensen's career, tore through the Billund workshop, destroying the factory and nearly every wooden toy design, tool, and pattern the company had developed over the previous decade. Standing in the ashes of everything he had built for the second time in his life, Christensen made the same stubborn decision he had made after the first fire. He rebuilt, larger and more determined than before, financing the reconstruction with loans he could barely afford to service. The post-war years brought the moment that would ultimately define the company's future, though almost no one recognized its significance at the time. In 1947, Christensen became one of the first businessmen in Denmark to purchase an injection molding machine, a piece of industrial equipment capable of producing plastic components with far greater precision and speed than traditional woodworking. Plastic was still viewed with deep suspicion by much of the toy industry, cheap, brittle, and considered an inferior substitute for real wooden craftsmanship. Christensen's own sales representatives openly doubted the investment, and one of his sons later recalled customers laughing at the idea of plastic toys replacing sturdy wooden ones. That same year, Christensen encountered a set of interlocking plastic bricks manufactured by a British company called Kiddicraft, invented by a man named Hilary Page. The bricks were far from perfect. They lacked any reliable mechanism to lock firmly together, meaning a child's carefully built tower could collapse if the table so much as wobbled. But Christensen recognized something in the underlying concept that Page himself had never fully realized: a toy that could be endlessly reconfigured, rebuilt, and reimagined by a child's own hands held a kind of value that no single wooden toy, however beautifully carved, could ever match. In 1949, Lego began producing its own version, calling them automatic binding bricks, an early, imperfect imitation of Page's design, made from a brittle type of plastic called cellulose acetate that warped easily and, crucially, still would not click securely together. For years, the bricks sold poorly. Danish toy retailers, skeptical of plastic and unconvinced that children wanted building blocks over trucks and dolls, ordered them reluctantly and in small quantities. Christensen's own board of directors, by now including his sons, who had taken on increasing responsibility as their father aged, debated abandoning the plastic brick line entirely, arguing that the company's future lay in the wooden toys and simple plastic items that had at least proven reliably profitable. The bricks that would eventually become the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar global empire were, in the early 1950s, viewed inside Christensen's own company as a stubborn, unprofitable distraction, and Ole Kirk Christensen, now in his 60s and in declining health after decades of fires, depressions, and financial near collapse, would not live to see whether his strange plastic bricks were a visionary breakthrough or simply his final, costly mistake. The turning point arrived through Ole Kirk Christensen's third son, Gottfried Kirk Christensen, who had joined the family business as a teenager and gradually assumed operational control as his father's health declined through the early 1950s. Gottfried believed, with a conviction his father and brothers did not fully share, that the plastic brick's fundamental flaw was not the material, but the engineering. If the bricks could be redesigned to lock together with real structural stability, the entire concept could be transformed from a novelty into something genuinely revolutionary. In 1954, on a transatlantic ocean liner traveling to a toy fair in England, a conversation with a department store buyer crystallized Gottfried's thinking further. The buyer complained that toys of the era lacked any coherent system, each one an isolated purchase disconnected from everything else in a child's toy box. Gottfried returned to Billund determined to build not just a better brick, but an entire interconnected system of play. Over the following 2 years, LEGO's engineers worked to solve the locking problem that had plagued the bricks since 1949. The breakthrough came in January 1958, when the company patented a new design featuring hollow tubes on the underside of each brick, which gripped the studs on top of the brick beneath it with far greater friction and stability than any previous version. It was a small mechanical change with an enormous consequence. Bricks built with this new design could now be stacked into towering, elaborate structures without collapsing. And, critically, bricks manufactured decades apart remained fully compatible with one another, a form of backward compatibility almost no toy manufacturer in the world had considered. Ole Kirk Christensen died just months after the patent was filed, in March 1958, having lived just long enough to see the beginning of what his stubborn plastic experiment might become, though not nearly long enough to witness its transformation into a global phenomenon. Gottfried, now firmly in control of the company, pursued an aggressive vision of expansion built entirely around the new brick system. He phased out LEGO's remaining wooden toy lines through the early 1960s, betting the company's entire future on plastic construction sets, at a moment when competitors still viewed the category as a passing fad. It was an enormous gamble. LEGO's revenues depended almost entirely on a product line barely 5 years old, built from a material Danish toy retailers had mocked just a decade earlier. But the bet paid off with startling speed. By the mid-1960s, LEGO sets were being exported across Western Europe, and in 1961, the company established its first overseas subsidiary in England, followed shortly by expansion into Germany, Sweden, and eventually North America. Disaster struck again in 1960, when a fire, the third catastrophic fire in the company's history, destroyed LEGO's wooden toy warehouse in Billund. Rather than treating it as a crisis, Gottfried used the destruction as final justification for a decision he had already been contemplating. LEGO would abandon wooden toys entirely and commit itself irreversibly to plastic bricks. It was a moment that could easily have broken a smaller, less determined company. Instead, it became the moment LEGO fully became the brand the world would come to recognize. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, LEGO expanded its ambitions well beyond individual brick sets. In 1968, the company opened Legoland Billund, an amusement park built entirely around massive sculptures constructed from millions of LEGO bricks, drawing over 500,000 visitors in its first year alone and establishing an entirely new revenue stream built on brand tourism rather than toy sales. The company introduced the LEGO minifigure in 1978, a small, jointed plastic figure that would go on to become one of the most recognizable toy characters ever produced, appearing eventually in the billions across LEGO sets worldwide. Each new product line reinforced the same underlying philosophy Gottfried had first articulated on that ocean liner in 1954. Every piece, regardless of when it was purchased, needed to function as part of one unified, endlessly expandable system. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, LEGO had become one of the most successful and admired toy companies in the world, a rare manufacturer whose products were praised as much by parents and educators as by children themselves for their emphasis on open-ended, imaginative construction rather than passive entertainment. The company weathered the rise of television and, later, early video game consoles, positioning itself as a wholesome, timeless alternative in an industry increasingly chasing fast-moving entertainment trends. Revenue grew steadily through the 1980s and into the 1990s, and by the middle of that decade, LEGO ranked among the most valuable toy brands on the planet, seemingly immune to the disruptive forces reshaping the rest of the industry. But immunity, it would turn out, was an illusion. As the 1990s progressed, children's entertainment preferences were shifting with a speed the company's leadership badly underestimated. Video games, licensed movie merchandise, and increasingly sophisticated electronic toys were capturing children's attention in ways that simple plastic bricks, however cleverly engineered, could not easily compete with. Rather than doubling down on the disciplined, system-based philosophy that had built the company, LEGO's leadership through the late 1990s made a fateful decision: to chase growth by expanding aggressively into territory far outside the brick itself. Theme parks, video games, clothing, and elaborate licensed product lines. A strategy that would soon push the company to the very edge of the abyss its founder had spent a lifetime narrowly escaping. By 1998, the year the LEGO Group posted its first ever loss in the company's history, the warning signs had been building for nearly a decade. Godfred's son, Kjeld Kirk Christiansen, now led the company his grandfather had founded, and under mounting pressure to reignite growth in an industry being reshaped by video games and blockbuster movie franchises, LEGO's leadership pursued an expansion strategy that abandoned almost every discipline that had made the company successful in the first place. Rather than deepening its core brick system, the company diversified wildly, launching LEGO-branded clothing lines, video games, television programming, a chain of retail stores, and a rapidly growing network of Legoland theme parks in California, Germany, and beyond, each requiring enormous capital investment with uncertain returns. The most consequential decision came from within the product line itself. Convinced that traditional bricks alone could no longer compete for children's attention, LEGO designers began developing increasingly complex, single-purpose pieces molded for one specific function in one specific set. A space helmet that could only ever be a space helmet, a vehicle chassis that fit only one particular model. It was the philosophical opposite of everything Godfred Kirk Christiansen had built the company around in 1954. Instead of a universal system where every piece connected to every other piece across decades, LEGO was manufacturing thousands of specialized disposable components with almost no reusability. Production costs soared as the company managed an ever-expanding catalog of unique molds, while the resulting sets, ironically, offered children less creative freedom than the simple system that had made LEGO famous in the first place. Compounding the crisis, LEGO's licensing strategy in the late 1990s pursued lucrative but enormously expensive partnerships, most significantly, a deal with Lucasfilm in 1999 to produce Star Wars-themed sets. The licensed sets sold well, but the royalty payments and production costs ate deeply into margins, and the broader diversification strategy meant the company was now managing an bewildering array of businesses: theme parks, apparel, video games, licensed toys, traditional sets, without the operational discipline to run any of them efficiently. Internal reports later revealed that LEGO had lost track of the actual profitability of individual product lines entirely. the company literally did not know which of its products made money and which were quietly bleeding it dry. By 2003, the crisis had become undeniable. Lego reported a net loss of over $190 million for the year, on top of losses the year before. The company's total debt exceeded $800 million, an almost incomprehensible figure for a private, family-controlled toy manufacturer. Warehouses across Europe were stacked with unsold inventory nobody wanted, the product of years of overproduction driven by wildly optimistic sales forecasts. Banks financing the company's debt began quietly signaling that continued losses at this rate would force a restructuring, and industry analysts openly speculated that Lego, a name synonymous with childhood creativity for half a century, might not survive as an independent company at all. Family members who had controlled Lego since Ole Kirk Christensen founded it in 1932 faced the very real possibility of losing the business entirely to creditors. In 2004, Kjeld Kirk Christiansen made the decision that would define the company's survival. He stepped back from day-to-day leadership and installed Jürgen Vig Knudstorp, a 35-year-old former McKinsey consultant with no prior experience running a toy company, as chief executive. Knudstorp's first act was brutally honest. He commissioned an internal analysis that concluded Lego was, by his own later description, essentially bankrupt in all but name, kept alive only by the family's willingness to continue injecting capital and by banks reluctant to trigger a collapse that would eliminate thousands of jobs across Denmark. Knudstorp's diagnosis cut against everything the company's leadership had believed for the previous decade. The problem, he concluded, was not that Lego had failed to diversify enough. It was that Lego had diversified far too much, chasing growth in directions that had nothing to do with the disciplined brick system that built the company in the first place. Theme parks, clothing lines, and video games had consumed enormous capital while distracting the company from its actual core competency. Even worse, Knudstorp's team discovered that Lego was manufacturing pieces so specialized and unprofitable that some individual products cost more to produce than they sold for, meaning the company was, quite literally, losing money on every unit shipped. Knudstorp proposed a plan that many inside the company considered almost suicidally aggressive given the circumstances. Sell off the theme parks entirely, discontinue the least profitable and most specialized product lines, regardless of how recently they had been developed, drastically simplify the catalog of brick molds, and return the company's entire design philosophy to the interconnected system logic Gottfried had established in 1954. It meant admitting that nearly a decade of strategic decisions made by the company's own family leadership had been catastrophically wrong. It meant laying off approximately 1,000 employees, a devastating blow in a company town like Billund, where Lego was not just an employer, but the entire economic foundation of the community. And it meant betting the survival of a 70-year-old family company on the theory that children, despite every trend suggesting otherwise, still wanted to build things with their own hands rather than watch pre-programmed entertainment unfold on a screen. There was no guarantee any of it would work. Lego's debt remained crushing. Its brand had been diluted by years of scattered, undisciplined expansion, and an entire generation of children were growing up with tablets, consoles, and streaming entertainment that made simple plastic bricks seem, to some industry observers, like a relic of a bygone era about to be swept away entirely. As Knudstorp prepared to present his restructuring plan to a family that had controlled this company since a desperate carpenter first started carving toys from scrap wood during the Great Depression, no one in that room could say with any certainty whether they were about to witness the rebirth of an icon or preside over its final collapse. Jürgen Vig Knudstorp's restructuring plan, presented to the Christiansen family in 2004, was approved despite deep internal resistance, and its execution over the following 4 years would become one of the most studied corporate turnarounds in modern business history. LEGO sold the 4 Legoland theme parks in 2005 to Merlin Entertainments for roughly $460 million, retaining only a minority stake. A painful admission that the diversification strategy of the previous decade had been a mistake, but a necessary one to raise capital and refocus the company's identity. The catalog of specialized single-purpose molds was ruthlessly cut, eliminating thousands of unique pieces that had drained profitability, while designers were instructed to return to the interconnected system logic that had defined the brand since 1958. Approximately 1,000 jobs were eliminated, a wrenching blow to Billund, a town whose entire economy revolved around the company Ole Kirk Christiansen had founded there in 1932. The turnaround's most unexpected success came from a source almost no one inside LEGO had taken seriously a decade earlier: adult collectors. Knudsorp's team discovered that a significant and growing portion of LEGO's most devoted customers were not children at all, but adults who had grown up with the bricks and never fully abandoned them. In 2008, the company formalized this insight by launching LEGO Architecture, a product line of detailed building sets aimed explicitly at adult hobbyists, followed by increasingly intricate expert-level sets across multiple product lines. This adult fan base, initially dismissed internally as a marketing curiosity, would eventually become one of the company's most reliably profitable segments, willing to pay premium prices for sets requiring dozens of hours to assemble. By 2008, just 4 years after the company had stood on the edge of bankruptcy, LEGO returned to profitability, and the recovery accelerated with startling speed through the following decade. The 2014 release of the LEGO Movie, a feature film built around the brand's own characters and aesthetic, became both a critical and commercial success, grossing nearly $470 million worldwide and reintroducing LEGO to a new generation of children and parents as something culturally relevant rather than nostalgic. Licensing partnerships that had once nearly bankrupted the company through mismanagement. Star Wars, Marvel, Harry Potter, and eventually collaborations across nearly every major entertainment franchise were now managed with the operational discipline Knudstorp had installed, generating enormous profit rather than quiet losses. By 2015, LEGO had surpassed Mattel and Hasbro to become, by revenue, the largest toy company in the world, a position it would hold for years afterward. Kjeld Kirk Christiansen, the grandson of Ole Kirk Christiansen, remained chairman of the LEGO Group's holding company through the recovery and beyond, having made the decision in 2004 that ultimately saved the family business by relinquishing direct control to an outsider with no toy industry experience. He would later describe it as the hardest decision of his career, harder, he said, than any product launch or expansion, because it required him to admit publicly that his own leadership had brought the company his family had spent 3 generations building to the brink of extinction. Knudstorp himself led LEGO until 2016, transforming from an unlikely outsider into one of the most respected chief executives in global manufacturing, credited with engineering a turnaround that business schools would study for decades as a case study in disciplined, focused strategy triumphing over reckless diversification. Today, the LEGO Group remains privately held by the Kirk Christiansen family, based in the same small Danish town of Billund, where Ole Kirk Christiansen once carved wooden toys from furniture scraps to keep his failing carpentry business alive during the Great Depression. The company that nearly collapsed in 2003 under the weight of its own unfocused ambition now produces tens of billions of individual bricks annually, sold in more than 130 countries, with a brand recognition that rivals any company on Earth. The interlocking tube and stud design, patented in January 1958, remains to this day fully compatible with bricks manufactured decades later. A single child's Lego set from the 1960s can still connect seamlessly with pieces purchased yesterday, a form of engineering permanence almost unheard of in modern consumer manufacturing. The lesson embedded in Lego's near collapse and resurrection is one that extends far beyond the toy industry. A company built on a single disciplined idea, a universal system where every piece connects meaningfully to every other piece, nearly destroyed itself the moment its leadership lost faith in that discipline and chased growth in every direction except the one that had made it successful. It was not competition from rival toy makers, nor the rise of video games, nor changing childhood habits that brought Lego to the edge of bankruptcy. It was the company's own decision to abandon the philosophy its founder's son had first articulated on an ocean liner in 1954. Its survival came not from inventing something new, but from the painful, humbling act of returning to what had always worked, stripped of the excess it had accumulated along the way. In the end, the story of Lego is not simply the story of a toy. It is the story of a company that had to nearly lose everything before it remembered exactly what it was.